What happens when a broken billionaire, haunted by the loss of his son, visits the cemetery on what would have been his child's 16th birthday? What happens when he sees a boy standing at that very grave, clutching a weathered baseball glove and staring at the headstone as if it holds all the answers to life's mysteries? You won't believe what unfolded next. It's a story about grief, connection, and second chances that will leave you questioning how much we truly understand about the people around us. The air was heavy with rain-soaked earth and the faint scent of wilting flowers. The cemetery stretched endlessly before him, rows of marble markers glinting under the grey sky like silent sentinels guarding secrets too painful for words. James Harrington stood there, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his tailored coat, feeling every ounce of the weight he'd carried for 5 long years. His shoes sank slightly into the damp grass, but he didn't care. Nothing mattered here except the name etched in stone, Ethan Harrington, beloved son. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the memories, the laughter, the arguments, the promises left unfulfilled, but they came rushing back anyway, relentless and sharp. And then he saw him. A boy, no older than 12 or 13, stood just a few feet away from Ethan's grave. He wore an oversized hoodie, its hood pulled up against the drizzle, and clutched something tightly to his chest. James froze, unsure whether to approach or retreat. Who was this kid? Why was he here? For a moment, anger flared within him. How dare someone intrude on this sacred space? But as quickly as the emotion rose, it faded, replaced by curiosity. Something about the way the boy stood, so still and solemn, made James hesitate. The boy didn't seem to notice James at first. His focus was entirely on the grave, his lips moving silently as though he was speaking directly to Ethan. James took a cautious step forward, the sound of his shoe squelching in the mud startling both of them. The boy turned abruptly, wide-eyed and startled, and James felt his breath catch. There was something familiar about those eyes, something achingly familiar. It wasn't possible, was it? Shaking off the thought, James cleared his throat. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice rough with disuse. The boy blinked, clutching the object in his arms even tighter. I'm sorry," he stammered. "I didn't mean to bother anyone. I just—" His voice trailed off, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the soft patter of rain and the distant caw of a crow perched on a nearby tree branch. Finally, the boy looked down at the item in his hands, a worn baseball glove, and said quietly, "This belonged to your son, didn't it?" James felt the world tilt beneath his feet. How could this stranger know such a thing? And why did the sight of that glove, frayed and scuffed from years of use, make his heart ache more than ever before? James stared at the boy, his mind racing. How could this kid possibly know about Ethan's glove? That glove had been a part of their lives for years, Ethan's prized possession, the one thing he never went anywhere without. James remembered teaching him how to catch with it, the way Ethan's face lit up when he finally got the hang of it. The memory was so vivid, so raw, that it felt like a punch to the gut. "What did you say?" James asked sharply, his voice trembling. "How do you know that glove belonged to my son?" The boy hesitated, his grip tightening on the worn leather. He glanced back at the headstone, then at James, as if weighing whether or not to trust him. Finally, he took a deep breath and said, "I found it, in the park near here, a couple of months ago. It was lying under a bench, all muddy and torn up. I thought maybe someone had lost it, but when I looked inside—" His voice trailed off again, and he slowly turned the glove over to reveal faded letters stitched into the lining, E.H. James felt the air leave his lungs. Those initials, they were unmistakable. Ethan had insisted on putting them there himself, proud of his full name even though most people just called him by his nickname. For a moment, James couldn't speak. His chest tightened, and he clenched his fists to steady himself. "Why didn't you bring it back sooner?" he demanded, his tone sharper than he intended. "Do you have any idea what this means to me?" The boy flinched at the harshness in James's voice, but didn't back down. "I wanted to," he admitted softly, "but I didn't know who it belonged to. Not at first. Then I saw the initials, and I figured it must be important. So I started coming here, to the cemetery. I thought maybe someone would come looking for it. And then I saw you today." He paused, his eyes searching James's face. Are you Ethan's dad?" The question hit James like a freight train. He nodded slowly, unable to find the words. The boy let out a shaky sigh, almost as if he'd been holding his breath waiting for confirmation. "I'm sorry," he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to upset you. I thought you should have it back." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The rain continued to fall, soaking through James's coat and plastering the boy's hoodie to his thin frame. But neither seemed to notice. James's mind was spinning. Who was this boy? Why had fate, or whatever force governed these things, brought him here today? And why did seeing that glove in his hands feel like both a gift and a cruel twist of the knife? Finally, James managed to choke out, "Thank you." The words sounded hollow, inadequate, but they were all he could muster. He reached out tentatively, half expecting the boy to pull away, but instead, the boy held the glove out to him without hesitation. Their fingers brushed briefly as James took it, and the contact sent a jolt through him, a strange mix of grief and gratitude and something else he couldn't quite name. "Can I ask you something?" the boy said suddenly, breaking the silence. James looked at him, startled. "Sure," he replied, though his voice still carried an edge of wariness. The boy hesitated, chewing on his lip before blurting out, "What was he like?" "Your son, I mean." The question caught James completely off guard. No one had asked him that in years, not since the funeral, when friends and family had gathered to share stories and shed tears. Since then, the world had moved on, leaving James alone with his memories. He opened his mouth to answer, but no words came. How could he possibly sum up Ethan in a few sentences? How could he explain the brightness of his smile, the stubbornness that drove James crazy, the kindness that made everyone love him? James began, his voice cracking. He cleared his throat and tried again. He was amazing. Smart, funny, always getting into trouble, but the good kind, you know? He loved baseball more than anything. Spent hours practicing, even when it rained. He gestured vaguely toward the glove in his hand. This was his favorite thing in the world. He used to say it was lucky. The boy nodded, listening intently. "Sounds like he was pretty cool," he said after a moment. There was a wistfulness in his tone that tugged at James's heart. "Yeah," James agreed quietly. "He was." They stood there for a while longer, the silence between them heavy but not uncomfortable. Eventually, the boy shifted awkwardly, glancing over his shoulder as if debating whether to leave. "Well, I guess I should go," he muttered. "I'm glad I got to give this back to you." James frowned, suddenly reluctant to let him go. "Wait," he said quickly. "What's your name?" The boy hesitated, clearly surprised by the question. "Liam," he said after a pause. "My name's Liam." "Liam," James repeated, testing the name on his tongue. "Do you live around here?" Liam shrugged, avoiding eye contact. "Kinda. Not far from the park where I found the glove." James studied him carefully, noting the threadbare state of his clothes and the way he kept glancing nervously at the ground. Something about him tugged at James's instincts, the same instincts that had once told him when Ethan was hiding something or needed help. "Are your parents nearby?" he asked gently. Liam stiffened, his expression darkening. "No," he said flatly. "It's just me." The response hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. James swallowed hard, unsure of what to say next. Before he could think of anything, Liam forced a small, awkward smile. "Anyway, thanks for letting me give this back. I'll see you around, maybe." Without waiting for a reply, he turned and started walking away, his footsteps squelching in the mud. "Liam, wait!" James called after him, surprising even himself. Liam stopped, but didn't turn around. "If you ever need anything, if you're in trouble or just need someone to talk to, you can find me, okay? I own Harrington Tech. You've probably heard of it." Liam glanced back, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Why would you help me?" he asked bluntly. "You don't even know me." James hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on him. Why would he help this boy? Was it guilt? Loneliness? Or was it something deeper, a longing to reconnect with the world, to honor Ethan's memory by reaching out to someone else who might need it? Whatever the reason, he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't just let Liam walk away. "Because everyone deserves a chance," James said firmly. "And because I think Ethan would want me to." Liam stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, he nodded once and disappeared into the misty afternoon, leaving James standing alone beside his son's grave, clutching the glove that now felt heavier than ever. James stood there for a long time after Liam vanished into the fog, his fingers tracing the worn leather of the glove. The rain had soaked through his coat now, chilling him to the bone, but he barely noticed. His mind was racing, replaying every word Liam had said, every glance, every flicker of emotion on the boy's face. There was something about him, something raw and unguarded, that reminded James painfully of Ethan. It wasn't just the baseball glove. It was the way Liam carried himself, like he'd been carrying burdens far too heavy for someone his age. As he turned to leave, James couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Something inside him, a quiet voice he hadn't heard in years, was telling him not to let go so easily. He didn't know why, but he felt certain that Liam needed help, even if the boy wouldn't admit it. And maybe, just maybe, helping Liam could be the first step toward healing himself. The drive back to his penthouse was a blur. The city streets were slick with rain, reflecting the neon lights in streaks of color that blurred together as James sped through intersections without really seeing them. When he finally stepped inside his apartment, the silence hit him like a wall. It was always silent here, no matter how many people filled the rooms during charity galas or business meetings. The emptiness followed him everywhere, clinging to him like a shadow he couldn't escape. He placed the glove carefully on the dining table, smoothing out its creases as though it might somehow bring Ethan closer. But instead of comfort, all he felt was an ache that refused to fade. Sitting down heavily in one of the chairs, he pulled out his phone and opened a search engine. Typing Liam and the name of the park where the glove had been found felt ridiculous, almost desperate, but he couldn't stop himself. If there was any chance of finding the boy again, he had to try. Hours passed as James scrolled through social media profiles, local news articles, and community forums, searching for any mention of a boy named Liam. Most of what he found was useless. A teenager winning a science fair, a man posting about his dog. But then, late into the night, he stumbled across something that made his heart skip a beat. A post from a local shelter thanked an anonymous donor who had dropped off supplies earlier that week. Attached to the post was a blurry photo of a young boy stacking boxes of canned food onto a shelf. The caption read, "Asterisk, thanks to our helper Liam for keeping spirits high." Asterisk. James stared at the image, his pulse quickening. It was him, the same hoodie, the same slight frame. This had to be the same Liam. Without thinking, he grabbed his keys and headed back out into the stormy night. The shelter wasn't far from the cemetery, tucked away in a part of town he rarely visited. As he approached, he saw the faint glow of its sign through the rain, the letters flickering slightly as if struggling to stay lit. Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of bleach and coffee. A few people sat scattered around the room, some sleeping on cots, others huddled over bowls of soup. James hesitated in the doorway, suddenly unsure of what to do. He wasn't used to places like this, places where life felt stripped down to its bare essentials. Everything about it was unfamiliar, uncomfortable, yet strangely humbling. "Can I help you?" a voice asked softly. James turned to see a woman in her mid-30s standing behind him, wearing a volunteer's apron and holding a clipboard. Her expression was kind but wary, as if she'd seen enough well-meaning visitors come and go without making a real difference. "I'm looking for someone," James said, his voice steadier than he expected. "A boy named Liam. He was here recently. I think he volunteers." The woman's eyes widened slightly in recognition. "Oh, yes. Liam comes by sometimes. He helps out whenever he can, though we haven't seen him in a couple of days. Is everything okay?" James hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "I met him earlier today. At the cemetery. I think he might need some help." The woman's gaze softened, and she nodded knowingly. "Liam doesn't talk much about himself, but it's clear he's had a rough time. He shows up here when he needs a meal or a place to rest, but he never stays long. We've tried to connect him with resources, but—" she trailed off, shaking her head. "Some kids are harder to reach than others." James felt a lump form in his throat. "Do you know where I can find him?" She frowned thoughtfully. "Not exactly. But he mentioned once that he spends a lot of time at the library downtown. Says it's quiet there, and they don't ask questions." She gave him a small, encouraging smile. "If you're serious about helping him, that's probably your best bet." James thanked her and left the shelter, his mind buzzing with possibilities. The library wasn't far, and despite the late hour, he decided to check anyway. The streets were nearly deserted now, the rain having driven most people indoors. When he arrived, the building was dark except for a dim light glowing in one corner of the second floor. Peering through the glass doors, he spotted a figure sitting alone at a table, hunched over a book. It was Liam. For a moment, James simply watched him, struck by how small and vulnerable he looked under the harsh fluorescent light. Then, steeling himself, he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The sound of his footsteps echoed softly in the empty space, causing Liam to look up sharply. His eyes widened in surprise, and maybe a hint of fear, when he recognized James. "What are you doing here?" Liam asked, his tone defensive but tinged with curiosity. James stopped a few feet away, hands shoved deep into his pockets. "I came to see if you were okay," he admitted, his voice softer than usual, "and to apologize. I shouldn't have let you walk away earlier without making sure you were safe." Liam blinked, clearly taken aback. "Why do you care?" he asked bluntly. "You don't even know me." James sighed, running a hand through his damp hair. "Maybe I want to," he said honestly. "Look, I lost my son 5 years ago. Ever since, I've felt stuck. Like I don't know how to move forward. Meeting you today, it made me realize that maybe I still have something to give. Maybe helping you is part of that." Liam stared at him, his expression unreadable. For a moment James thought he might bolt, but instead the boy leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "So what? You're gonna adopt me now, or something?" The question caught James off guard, and he chuckled despite himself. "No, nothing like that. I want to help. Whatever that looks like. If you'll let me." Liam studied him for a long moment, his guard slowly lowering. Finally, he shrugged and muttered, "Guess it couldn't hurt to hear you out." And just like that, the ice began to crack. James felt a flicker of hope ignite in his chest, fragile but real. He pulled out the chair across from Liam and sat down, leaning forward slightly to bridge the gap between them. "I'm not here to fix everything overnight," he said carefully, choosing his words with deliberate care. "But I can offer you some stability, for as long as you need it. A place to stay, food on the table, maybe even a chance to figure out what's next for you." Liam raised an eyebrow, skepticism written all over his face. "You barely know me," he pointed out. "What if I turn out to be trouble? Or worse, what if I don't want your help?" James nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth in Liam's words. "That's fair," he admitted. "But sometimes, people just need someone willing to take a risk on them. And honestly, Liam, I think you're worth it." The boy shifted uncomfortably, glancing down at the book in front of him, a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. His fingers traced the edge of the cover absently, betraying a nervousness that didn't quite match his tough exterior. "Why?" he asked quietly, almost under his breath. "Why would you risk anything for me?" James hesitated, searching for the right answer. How could he explain something he barely understood himself? Finally, he settled on honesty. "Because I see a lot of Ethan in you," he confessed. "Not because you look alike or anything like that, but because you remind me of how he used to be before. Well, before life got hard. He had this stubborn streak, this determination to keep going no matter what. It's rare these days. And I think, if you'll let me, I can help you hold on to that." For a moment, Liam didn't respond. The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncertain. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "My mom died last year," he said abruptly, the words tumbling out like they'd been waiting too long to escape. "Cancer. We didn't have much money, so we couldn't afford treatment. Not the kind she needed, anyway. After she was gone, there wasn't anyone left to take care of me. Foster care sounded worse than being on my own, so I ran." His confession hit James like a punch to the gut. He wanted to say something, anything, to ease the pain behind those words, but he knew better than to interrupt. Instead, he waited, giving Liam the space to continue. "I've been bouncing around ever since," Liam went on, his voice steadier now. "Sometimes I crash with friends, other times I sleep wherever I can find shelter. It's not great, but it's better than the alternative." He glanced up at James, his eyes sharp and defiant. "I don't need pity, okay? I do what I have to." James swallowed hard, fighting back the lump in his throat. "I'm not offering pity," he said firmly. "I'm offering a hand. No strings attached. At least, not yet. But if you decide to trust me, I promise you won't regret it." Liam stared at him, weighing the offer in silence. James could practically see the gears turning in his head, the battle between pride and desperation playing out behind his guarded expression. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Liam sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Fine," he muttered reluctantly. "But if this turns into some rich guy guilt trip, I'm out." "Deal." A small smile tugged at the corners of James's mouth. "Deal," he agreed. Over the next few weeks, James introduced Liam to a world he hadn't known existed, or perhaps one he'd forgotten about. They started small. New clothes, decent meals, a warm bed in the guest room of James's penthouse. At first, Liam kept his distance, wary of letting his guard down completely. But gradually, he began to open up, revealing pieces of himself that James hadn't expected. Beneath the toughness was a sharp mind, a quick wit, and a deep love for stories. Books, movies, anything that transported him to another reality. One evening, as they sat together watching an old baseball game on TV, Liam turned to James and asked, "Do you miss him?" "Ethan, I mean." James froze, caught off guard by the question. He set his drink down on the coffee table and took a deep breath. "Every day," he admitted softly. "Some days more than others. There are moments when I forget, you know? Like when I hear a song he loved or smell something that reminds me of him. And then it hits me all over again, that he's really gone." Liam nodded thoughtfully, his gaze fixed on the screen. "Must suck," he said simply. "It does," James replied with a wry smile. "But having you around helps. You remind me of him in ways I didn't realize I needed." Liam looked at him sharply, surprise flashing across his face. "Really?" "Yeah," James said, his tone softening. "He would have liked you. Probably would have driven me crazy trying to get me to let you join our pickup games." They both laughed at that, the sound filling the room with a warmth neither of them had felt in years. For the first time in a long time, James felt a glimmer of light breaking through the darkness that had consumed him since Ethan's death. It wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was enough. Months passed, and Liam became a permanent fixture in James's life. With James's support, Liam enrolled in school, excelling in classes that challenged him and finding camaraderie among classmates who accepted him for who he was. In return, Liam brought a vibrancy to James's world that had been missing for far too long. Together they built a new kind of family, one forged not by blood, but by choice. One afternoon, as they stood side by side at Ethan's grave, Liam placed a fresh bouquet of flowers beside the headstone. "Thanks for sharing your dad with me," he said quietly, glancing at James. "I think he'd be proud of us." James smiled, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. "I think so too," he replied, and for the first time in years he truly believed it. As the seasons changed, so did the bond between James and Liam. What started as an unlikely friendship grew into something deeper, a connection neither of them had anticipated but both desperately needed. One crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves swirled in the wind outside the penthouse windows, James found himself watching Liam intently as the boy worked on a school project at the dining table. There was a quiet determination in his movements, a focus that reminded James of Ethan during those rare moments when he'd sit still long enough to tackle homework or build one of his elaborate Lego creations. "You know," James said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence, "you've got potential, kid. Real potential. Don't waste it." Liam glanced up, startled by the comment. "What do you mean?" he asked, setting down his pencil. James leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "I mean, you're smart. You work hard. And you've got grit, something most people don't have. I see it in you every day. But life's not gonna hand you opportunities, Liam. You've got to grab them yourself." Liam frowned, chewing on the inside of his cheek. "You sound like my mom," he muttered after a moment. "She used to say stuff like that all the time." "Well, she sounds like she knew what she was talking about," James replied with a small smile. "And maybe, just maybe, I'm starting to understand where she was coming from." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Liam looked away, his gaze drifting toward the window. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, softly, Liam said, "Do you think I could really make something of myself? Like, actually change things?" James didn't hesitate. "Absolutely," he said firmly. "But it's not going to be easy. Nothing worth doing ever is. You'll stumble, you'll doubt yourself, but if you keep pushing forward, I promise you'll get there." Liam nodded slowly, absorbing the advice. He picked up his pencil again, but instead of returning to his project, he tapped it against the table thoughtfully. "What about you?" he asked finally. "Do you think you can change too?" The question caught James off guard. He straightened, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Liam hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Ever since I met you, you've been different. Not just with me. With everything. You laugh more. You talk about Ethan without looking like you're about to break. It's like, I dunno, like you're letting yourself live again. Do you think that's possible for good? Or is this just temporary?" James felt a lump rise in his throat. He hadn't realized how much Liam had noticed, or how much he'd changed since their paths crossed. 4 years, he'd convinced himself that moving on wasn't an option, that grief was something you carried forever. But now, standing here with Liam, he wondered if maybe healing wasn't about forgetting, it was about finding new ways to remember. "I hope so," James admitted quietly. "For both of us." Time continued to pass, each day bringing new challenges and triumphs. Liam thrived in school, earning accolades for his academic achievements and even joining the baseball team, much to James's delight. On weekends, they visited the cemetery together, leaving notes or small mementos for Ethan. Sometimes they talked about him. Other times, they simply sat in companionable silence, sharing stories about their week or debating which superhero would win in a fight. One spring afternoon, as they walked through the park near the cemetery, Liam stopped abruptly and turned to James. "Can I ask you something?" he said, his tone unusually serious. "Of course," James replied, stopping beside him. "What happens next?" Liam asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "I mean, I know I've got school and stuff, but what about after that? Where does this go? Us, I mean." James exhaled slowly, considering the question. He'd asked himself the same thing countless times over the past months. Their relationship had evolved organically, built on trust and mutual respect, but he knew it couldn't stay undefined forever. "I guess that depends on you," he said finally. "If you want, we can make this permanent. Legally, officially, you'd be part of the family. No pressure, though. Just know that you always have a home with me." Liam stared at him, his eyes wide with surprise. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. "As serious as I've ever been," James replied, his own voice thick with emotion. "You're already family to me, Liam. This would just be making it official." Tears welled up in Liam's eyes, but he blinked them away quickly, trying to maintain his tough exterior. "Okay," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Yeah, okay." James pulled him into a tight hug, feeling the weight of the moment settle over them. It wasn't perfect. They both carried scars that would never fully heal, but it was enough. More than enough. Years later, as Liam stood on stage accepting his college diploma, James watched from the audience, pride swelling in his chest. Beside him sat an empty chair, adorned with a single red rose, a tribute to Ethan, who should have been there to witness the milestone. As Liam scanned the crowd and locked eyes with James, he smiled brightly, mouthing 2 simple words, "Thank you." In that moment, James knew they'd done it. Together, they'd found a way to honor the past while building a future filled with hope, resilience, and love. And as the applause echoed around them, James realized something profound. Grief doesn't disappear, it transforms. It becomes gratitude, strength, and the courage to keep moving forward. Because sometimes, the people we lose send us exactly who we need to find.